Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me in this session. My name is Leah Guren. I'm with CowTC, and I love helping my clients take their old legacy content and turn it into something lean and clean. I've spent most of my career fighting the good fight against fluff, and I hope that by the end of this session, you'll have decided to join me and help stamp out fluff and unnecessary content wherever we find it. Because after all, we know everyone just loves reading tons and tons of dense text, right? Sheesh. Listen, at the best of times, nobody wants to read this stuff. But now, with everything we're going through, it's no wonder that people are feeling anxious and stressed and are having trouble concentrating. I don't know about you, but for me, there have been plenty of days in these last few months where I felt like my brain is congealed cream of wheat. It's really hard to focus and concentrate. So now more than ever, we need clean, lean content. So what are we going to do today? I'll give you a little bit of an introduction and introduce some of the reasons why we need to have lean content. Then I'll share with you 4 very easy tricks, things that you can do to your legacy content. And then 3 slightly more involved solutions that go a little bit beyond just the text. You'll be able to ask questions at the end. There is a chat box on the right-hand side of your console here that you're seeing. I do ask that you hold those questions until the end so they don't just scroll past and I won't have a chance to see them. Also, for those of you who want to continue the discussion, I'll be hosting a Zoom session immediately after this session. The meeting code appears on the last slide of this presentation. And that will just be an unstructured opportunity for us to get together, kind of like we would if this was a real face-to-face conference, hanging around, chatting about the topic, answering questions, sharing ideas. So let's get started. First, the case for minimalism. Probably you all know exactly why we need to do this. So why am I bothering covering these topics? Well, the reason is you may need to actually persuade either a coworker, a product manager, a client, someone like that, who's still in love with their old-fashioned linear, bombastic academic writing style. And it becomes really difficult at times to convince them why it's so necessary to go lean. So let's start by looking at the business case. Bottom line is fluff is expensive. Every single word that's unnecessary carries with it a lot of hidden costs. That means if you go to leaner content, you end up spending less money on both producing content, maintaining it, updating it, curating it. All of that overhead is diminished in proportion to the amount of words you can cut. It also means that your localization process is going to be faster, less problematic, and most certainly less expensive. It just makes sense. The difference between translating 10 pages or translating 2 pages, it makes a huge difference. Not only that, lean content in general tends to be easier to translate because of the simplicity of the language. Also, this makes it much easier to reuse your content. So whether or not your company has already gone for a single sourcing solution, this is a necessary first step in getting your content clean enough so that it can be reused. Finally, when I have clients who are still very, very reluctant to get on board with lean content, I remind them that lean content projects a more professional and more modern image. When your client has a high-tech product, it's kind of the kiss of death to tell them that their content looks old-fashioned and that it kind of paints the company with that brush of kind of seeming to be out of date and out of touch with current trends. So I found that this particular argument wins the day for me in many cases when nothing else will convince a client. Now let's look at the user experience side. Fluff is horrible. We know that. It's just dreadful. It has been proven by so many usability tests that it obscures information in so many different ways. That means that if you have lighter content, users will be able to find what they're looking for more easily. And then once they find it, they're more likely to be able to actually understand it. Your users will be less likely to get frustrated and give up. But there's also a little bit more to that. We have a lot of data about how users' expectations have evolved. If we look at how people use applications, whether it's an application on their smartphone or cloud-based software or anything, their wait tolerance is much shorter. People are expecting the applications themselves to be quicker, to present information more quickly. And that holds true as well for searching for content. So searching for something within the content, we know that as recently as 20 years ago, people would invest up to 60 seconds, a whole minute. The last data I saw, which is already a few years old, was 15 seconds. And I suspect that given the current situation, it's probably more like 5 seconds. People need to find what they're looking for very quickly, or they'll give up. In addition, we have a higher level of resistance than we've ever seen before on the part of the users to actually read user guides or manuals or online help. They don't trust our content, they don't want to read it, they'd rather go outside of your content and Google or look on YouTube or whatever. And part of that is because so many users have been burned over the years by fluffy, unhelpful content. Finally, there's a case for lean content as far as your career and how it can help you. Lean writing skills are a superpower. I say that because not everyone can do this. Not everyone can walk into a situation and look at a big block of text and realize how the entire thing could be replaced by 2 carefully positioned words and an icon. The ability to do that sets you apart from people and gives you kind of an edge in your career. And I've seen this over and over again where we walk in where clients have been struggling with something, present a solution, and they just sort of look at us like, wow, how did you do that? So you can see there's a compelling case. There are 3 compelling cases: the business case, the user experience case, and your own career case for going lean. So let's get started. Let's look at 4 easy fixes. So get ready to Marie Kondo your content. We're going to flatten the fluff, ditch the detail, tank the topic, and go graphic. So number 1, flatten the fluff. Fluff is evil, and it's everywhere. Now, before I go any further, let me make one thing clear. Fluff has an important role in interpersonal communication. I'm not telling you to remove the social niceties and the politeness and the diplomacy that we all need in dealing one-on-one with coworkers, family members, friends, whatever. But that's not what we're talking about here. This isn't breaking it to your sister that her haircut is terrible. This is content that's going out to end users. So when we talk about content that is in product documentation, fluff is truly evil. And yes, I see it everywhere. By fluff, we're talking about things like unnecessary passive voice. It makes the sentences longer, harder to parse, harder to translate. It creates this cognitive friction and just makes things so much harder for your users. The same thing for complex, pompous word choice. When somebody says obtain instead of get. The acid test that I always tell my students in my course is imagine yourself saying this to a colleague. Imagine that somebody pokes their head into your cubicle and says, hey, how do I? And would you say something like, users are instructed to direct their attention to the aforementioned area of the, no, come on. Talk to your users the way you would talk to a colleague. It doesn't mean it's rude or brew-esque or unprofessional. It's just simple and straight to the point, using the simplest possible vocabulary. And look for these empty phrases, things like at this point in time instead of saying now. All of these pop up, and those of you who have a strong background in academic writing, it may take years to break those habits. This was a little snippet of some text in a manual for a piece of heavy machinery that was on a factory floor. Part of the maintenance manual, in fact. So what do we have here? It is recommended that all residual standing water, oh my goodness. We've got passive voice, unnecessary modifiers, redundant phrases, and pompous vocabulary. The rewrite? Drain tanks completely before starting maintenance. Short, to the point, active voice, simple vocabulary. Number 2, ditch the detail. Unnecessary detail is so unnecessary. I have this fight all the time with SMEs, product managers, people who think that the user should be interested in this particular detail, or that somebody needs to know something, or this is important. 99% of the time, it's some sort of internal information that nobody needs to know. Remember, your entire guideline is to provide information that allows users to use a product safely and effectively. That's it. It doesn't say that you need to tell them every single possible detail about this product. There's a lot of information out there that people don't need to know. It's not an essential part of their workflow. Think, for example, about things where it doesn't really matter. Does it matter if people add the salt first and then the flour? If not, don't specify. Don't break information or procedures down into steps when it doesn't really matter if they do 1, 2, 3 or 3, 1, 2 or what. Simply, that doesn't need to be documented. Now, there's a little backstory to this. I was doing training with a client who was located outside of Nice in France. At the first break in the workshop, I went down the hall to the restrooms, and inside one of the stalls in the women's room, there was this sign printed out on the local printer and pasted up on the door. Now, I didn't replicate the exact photo I took because it's too blurry, but trust me, the text in here is exactly as it appeared in that sign, complete with punctuation and capitalization oddities. This is what was there. And I thought this was such a compelling example of evil fluff in its natural habitat that I took it off the door, brought it back with me when the session began again, and told people we're not continuing with anything else until you guys fix this. Now, those of you who are familiar with French know that French is a very fluffy language. So this was a hard challenge for them to start thinking in a lean and clean manner. It led to recriminations and a few tearful breakdowns and multiple cigarette breaks and infinite cups of coffee. And eventually we got there. Now, what was the problem with this? Of course, there's a ton of unnecessary blah blah, but the worst part is it was missing the most important detail. So the solution that we finally got to, this. Please help us save water. That was it. Now, I know some of you are thinking, why is Leah allowing somebody to use please in content? And it's true. If we're talking about product documentation, we never say please, but you have to understand the scenario. When it comes to manuals, online help, user guides, quick starts, those are all product content where the user is coming to you. The user is basically asking you a question. They're saying, how do I, and you're answering their question. If somebody says, how do I get to the train station? You don't say, please go 2 blocks up and then turn left. No, you say go 2 blocks up, turn left. You're answering their question. But this kind of content is different. This is content that nobody asked for. Nobody looked for it. Nobody expected it. You're sitting there in the toilet stall minding your own business, and this content is pushed on you. It's on the inside of the stall. Since you didn't ask for it or request it or want it and have no context for it, it's only natural that we provide the motivation. Why do we want you to do this thing? And in that particular scenario, I think please is not fluff at all. It's a very essential and well-used word in this particular solution. Number 3, tank the topic. Here's how I look at it. Why would you wash a pair of socks if you're just going to throw them out? And by that I mean, why waste time editing content that can be discarded in its entirety? What we're talking about is old legacy content that may still be hiding out in your content without anybody noticing. Things like conventions used, or things that instruct users on really basic computer navigation and things. And this happens quite frequently. If you have a big complex product that was first launched 15 or 20 years ago and has gone through tons and tons of revisions and rewrites and facelifts and new UIs and everything like that, the chances are there's some old legacy content that has still made the cut every time without anyone noticing. So this was a software application, and this was actually a topic. There was a whole chapter with this kind of information about using the system. Who needs to know that? Who doesn't know this already? The solution? You got it. Took the whole thing out. That was basically 15 pages of content that went bye-bye that never needed to be there. And finally, go graphic. You know that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Not always, but if it's the right picture, it can really help. So if we're talking about something physical parts, assembling, putting things together, taking things apart, doing any kind of a physical action, I want to see it. Show me. The same thing, rather than try to talk me through where to find something in a complex user interface, show me. Now, you don't need to go full IKEA. I don't expect people to get down to the point where they have almost wordless documentation. It's not practical or even appropriate for most of us with the kinds of products and services that we document. But you can reduce a lot of words by simple use of icons. For example, good icon usage can label the type of information and make search and retrieval much faster for users. Think about these two, for example. The little red chili or the green leafy thing. Those are common symbols that you would see on menus that would label food as spicy or vegetarian, respectively. And they work as a really, really good signposting tool, so users can scan the menu very quickly and visually spot the kind of thing they're looking for. In my case, I'm vegetarian and I like spicy food, So I can scan a menu really quickly, looking for those items that have both icons. It's a wonderful shortcut for users, and it really telescopes a lot of information into that single simple little icon. Another thing that's becoming more and more common as we move to cloud-based applications is the fact that a company may have a free or a budget version of their application, and then a premium or more advanced version that has more features. It's very common now to do one set of documentation and simply label the premium features and functions with a special icon. So here was an example from P&P, policy and procedure content. In other words, this was content that was not meant to go to an external customer, but was meant for the company's employees. It was actually part of the corporate employee handbook. And there were about 3 pages of text dealing with ergonomics and how to avoid RSI, how to set your office up, all kinds of things like that. Okay, it was a lot of blah blah that no one would read, but there's a bigger problem there. Think about this. You set up your office maybe once, but there was a lot of information in there that had to do with behavior, using correct posture when you sit, sitting up straight, taking breaks, doing stretching exercises. All of these are changes to people's behavior. And changes to behavior do not usually occur if you just read some text once and then sign a form to verify that you read it. You're going to forget it 30 seconds later as soon as you walk out of the HR office. That's it. So the solution? Put it in a form like an infographic that was scattered around the office in various places, as a poster in the lunchroom, by the copy machine, in various places, so people could see and be reminded from time to time. This was really going graphic, getting rid of all of that text. So now let's take a look at a few slightly deeper approaches. We're going to deliberate the deliverable, open with the outcome, and embed and shred. Let's go. First, deliberate the deliverable. What does that mean? It means don't fix the wrong solution. If your client has a manual and the manual is not the right approach, then rather than fixing the manual, consider what the final deliverable really should be. Now, this is a huge, huge problem because very often when people do audience analysis, they focus on who the user is and what the user knows, but they forget to ask where will the user use the product and how will they need that content. There's a huge difference. A lineman who has to climb up on the top of a power pole can't exactly carry a manual up there. Nor can you take old legacy content from a manual and just port it over into some sort of a handheld device that the person can look at when they're at the top of a pole. It's not going to fit, it's not going to work, the structure is going to be wrong. In this example, I had a client about 30 years ago, we're going way back, and they had an electronic point of sale machine. Basically, that's a cash register, that's a computer. Back in those days, we didn't have the capabilities of having sophisticated embedded help right on the screen. So there was a manual. I'm just using this as representational. This was not the exact manual, but it was in a big 3-ring binder. Yikes, that's a big binder. The client called me in because their customers were very, very unhappy with the documentation. They gave a really, really bad review. So I took one of the manuals and opened it up, expecting to see horrible writing and inconsistent terminology and vague, horrible stuff and unstructured content and all sorts of other things. The truth was, the content was pretty good. The writing was clear and simple. The terminology was consistent. The graphics matched the user interface. It was structured well. The procedures were easy to follow. I didn't see anything that leapt off the page to me as a clue to why the users hated it so much. So I told the client that I needed to meet with some users, and they arranged an opportunity for me to go and meet one of their local customers. And I walked in and saw that the point of sale machine was sitting in a kiosk. The user basically had no desk real estate. They didn't even have a place to store the manual. And even if they didn't have room on this little kiosk shelf to open up the manual and see anything. The solution? It wasn't a rewrite at all. In fact, I barely rewrote anything. It was a redesign. Again, sorry, this is just representational of some calendar or something. But we used this kind of deliverable. We used a spiral bind across the top and a little kickstand here so it would stand up. We designed the entire thing so that its footprint was about that big, about the size of a deck of cards. And they definitely had room on their little kiosk to have it there right next to them at the point of sale system. The user feedback was instantaneous. They all loved the new manual, and they thought that the instructions were so clear and easy to follow. Honestly, I can take zero credit for the quality of the content. It was simply rethinking the deliverable. Number 2, open with the outcome. Start by thinking about the goal. Start by solving the pain points that exist. So think of this, no documentation exists in a vacuum. It's there because your client has some particular pain point. Either you need the documentation so that people can use the product, or it might be some internal policy and procedure thing, or whatever. There's always a reason for it. And if you don't address that reason first and foremost, you might end up with a lot of entirely unnecessary content. In this example, the client had a security system. The security system was sold as a base kit that had kind of like the hub and all the instructions for how to set it up and configure it and guidelines and all of that. And it came with a certain amount of sensors. But you could buy additional sensors. So as additional sensors were simply packaged separately. That was it. And the packaging for each sensor had originally come with a 20-page A4 doc that was done by the engineers. It was full of schematics, these black box details, descriptions of features. It was completely full of information that nobody needed and yet didn't have what people actually needed. In other words, it didn't address the pain point. The pain point being somebody already has the system. Now they just need to add a few more sensors. What's the minimum amount of stuff we have to put in that box? The reaction to people seeing that 20-page document was, good grief, do I really have to know all of this? The solution? It was a 3x5 card. This was it, or a replication of it. That went in the box, and that's all they needed to know. They didn't need to know anything else. We didn't need to have schematics. We didn't need to have descriptions of features. We didn't need to have any of that internal stuff. And all the other technical information and detailed setup and usage was in the documentation for the whole kit. Finally, embed and shred. Listen, anytime that we can get rid of external content, that's probably a good thing, because external content is not always practical. Think again about that, person in a weird situation who's trying to do a procedure and has no place to put the manual, or no way to turn pages, or no way to scroll through content on a tablet or a smartphone. It's not always practical. So the best place for content is often within the user interface. We all know that. So think of things like kiosks, passport scanners, ATMs, supermarket self-checkout, anything like that has to have all the instructions right there that matches the workflow that the users go through and has all the text they need right there on the screen. We've even successfully done partial embedded content with large machines. I'm talking about machines that don't necessarily have screens. For example, on some factory floor machines, what we did was put key critical tasks right inside the panel. So when a particular panel on the machine is opened, the technician sees there the top 2 or 3 procedures that are most likely going to be performed when they open up that particular panel. Maybe that's the area where you can change out belts, or the place where oil can be checked or changed. And we would put that information in large print with clear, simple illustrations, laminated and glued to the inside of the door. And of course, medical devices, we're seeing more and more that have embedded screens, and that's the place for the content. You never want an ICU nurse to have to run and try and find a manual to figure out what to do. And even when they're trained on devices and they can't remember a particular thing, that content has to be embedded on the screen. So my last example is actually a happy story. This is a dental device, and the client got it right. Every single step of the process has clear instructions on the screen, step by step, exactly what to do, the graphics guiding them to where the proper thing is. And this obviously is the ideal situation. It doesn't mean that all the content can be there. Clearly, there's a lot of content that has to do with setting the system up and maintenance and training information and other things that may be separate. But it is so essential that during day-to-day usage, that important content that follows the user's workflow is right there. Make it as easy and simple as possible. So, Lean makes sense for so many reasons. We saw that there are multiple very strong business cases for Lean content. We know that, we know that for the users it makes sense, and we know that for you it makes sense. We've seen some easy fixes: flatten the fluff, ditch the detail, tank the topic, and get graphic. And then we looked at a few things that you can do that go a little bit beyond that, of thinking about the actual deliverable, thinking about the outcome, and finally, of course, embed and shred. So here's where you got to get to tell me what you think and get to ask me all your questions. So go ahead and start putting those questions into that text area, the chat or the question box there. And while you're doing that, let me share with you a few resources that I really love. First of all, the Fog Index Calculator is fantastic. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Gunning and Mueller Fog Index, that basically is an algorithm that measures how complex reading is and assigns a grade level that kind of indicates how many years of education somebody needs to be able to read and parse and understand something the first time they read it. They call this first-time comprehension. So having actual numbers, actual metrics that we can use is really useful. So when this session is over and you have some free time, Google Fog Index Calculator, and it'll take you to a web page where you can simply paste in a block of text, press a button, and get a Fog Index score. And then you can use that as the benchmark and kind of say, let me rewrite this, make it cleaner, leaner, and test it again and see if you can get the numbers down. I find it incredibly useful to have a metric instead of just trying to guess it or eyeball it. The second resource that I really love is the Plain Language Initiative. And that's a super cool thing that was initiated almost simultaneously in the UK and the United States and has been replicated in other countries around the world. If you look at the site in the US under the Plain Language Initiative, you'll find a really good website that has the rationale behind it, and it also has a lot of before and after examples that should kind of whet your appetite and get you in the mood for doing these kind of edits, to take old, pompous, fluffy, obtuse academic writing and turn it into something lean and clean and understandable. For those of you who want to continue the discussion, I'm going to be having a Zoom meeting right after this session. This is the meeting ID. That's all you need, assuming that you are already signed up on Zoom. All you need to do is start Zoom and type in this meeting number. You don't need a password. We're going to have it kind of free form, so you're all welcome to come in with video if you want, and you won't be muted, and we can talk and chat and ask questions, answer questions, and continue the discussion. So now I'm ready to start addressing the questions that I see coming in here. For those of you who want to sign out now, thank you very much for attending. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for being a good sport about adapting to our virtual conference. And I really, truly hope that at some point in the not too far future, I get to meet some of you guys in person once again at real face-to-face summits. Take care, everyone. Be healthy, be safe, keep your spirits up. We'll get through this. And now for your questions.